The final note hung in the air, a shimmering ethereal thread that seemed to defy gravity, then slowly, exquisitely, dissolved into the hushed sanctity of the grand theater. A collective breath, held captive for minutes, exhaled as one, rippling through the enraptured audience. Then, a thunderous wave of applause erupted, echoing off gilded ceilings and velvet seats, a visceral response to the raw power and heartbreaking beauty that had just unfolded on stage. On the stage, bathed in a single brilliant spotlight, stood Ilara. Her chest heaved, not from exertion, but from the profound emotional catharsis of having poured her very soul into the aria. Her dark hair, meticulously styled for the role, had escaped its pins, framing a face still glistening with artistic sweat, her eyes luminous with tears near the surface. She bowed, a graceful, almost deferential acknowledgement of the overwhelming adoration, her heart swelling with a bittersweet triumph. This was the pinnacle of what she lived for, the fleeting moment where all struggle dissolved into pure, unadulterated artistry. This, she thought, was living. Yet, as the curtain slowly descended, drawing a veil over the adoring faces and the intoxicating applause, the harsh realities of her life in the sprawling, relentless metropolis of New York City began to creep back in. Ilara was a phenomenon, a rising star whispered about in hushed tones within certain elite circles, known for a voice that could shatter glass or mend a broken heart with equal ease. Hailing from a small, unassuming town in the heartland of America, where cornfields stretched further than the eye could see, and aspirations were often tethered to the familiar rhythms of rural life, Ilara had always been different. Her voice, discovered almost by accident during a church choir practice, had been an undeniable, almost mystical force. It was a voice that demanded to be heard, a talent too grand for the quiet confines of her upbringing. With unyielding dedication, fueled by an almost spiritual connection to the music, she had chased her dream across thousands of miles, landing in the vibrant, unforgiving cultural crucible of New York. She possessed a rare gift, a soprano that moved effortlessly from delicate pianissimo to a soaring fortissimo, imbued with an interpretive depth far beyond her 27 years. Her technical prowess was impeccable, honed through years of relentless practice, often singing until her throat ached and her spirit soared. Every spare moment was dedicated to mastering new roles, perfecting her technique, and immersing herself in the intricate narratives of opera. She held a profound respect for the artistry, viewing each performance not just as a display of vocal agility, but as an act of storytelling, a fragile, ephemeral bridge between the composer's vision and the audience's soul. Her commitment was absolute, her passion an unquenchable fire, but passion, she was learning, did not pay the rent. Backstage, the euphoria of the performance began to recede, replaced by a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. The theater, her sanctuary, would soon be empty, and she would return to her reality. That reality was a tiny, cramped apartment in a perpetually noisy corner of the city, a place she now stood on the precipice of losing. The eviction notice, stark and unforgiving, had been taped to her door just 2 days prior. The landlord, a man with eyes as cold as January mornings, had made it clear: pay the 3 months back rent by the end of the week, or find herself on the street. Her dreams, so vivid and tangible just moments ago on stage, now seemed perilously close to shattering against the unyielding wall of financial hardship. The few small gigs she managed to secure, often for obscure experimental productions or as a last-minute understudy, barely covered her basic necessities, let alone the exorbitant cost of living in Manhattan. The prestigious opera companies she dreamt of joining required extensive, expensive auditions, often with travel costs she couldn't afford. Each rejection letter, each politely worded, "We regret to inform you," chipped away at her resilience, slowly eroding the boundless optimism she had arrived with. Her student loans from a top-tier music conservatory loomed like a dark cloud, a constant oppressive reminder of the debt she accrued chasing this elusive dream. The weight of it all, the relentless struggle to merely survive while nurturing a talent meant for grand stages, was becoming unbearable. Was this it? Was this the end of her operatic journey, not with a crescendo, but with a whimper, forced back to the quiet life she had so desperately tried to escape? The thought alone was a bitter, metallic taste in her mouth. The world out there, beyond the footlights, was a harsh, indifferent place for aspiring artists without a safety net. The magic of her voice, the hours of dedication, the emotional vulnerability she poured into every note, none of it seemed to translate into a sustainable existence. The eviction notice wasn't just a threat to her living situation. It was a symbol, a stark embodiment of her fading hope. It felt like the city itself was trying to choke the music out of her, to force her to concede defeat. But deep down, beneath the fear and the weariness, a stubborn ember of defiance still glowed. She refused to let her voice be silenced. This could not be the end. If Ilara's journey resonates with you, if you've ever faced impossible odds chasing a dream, then you understand the fierce determination that burned within her. Don't miss a single note of her captivating story. Make sure to subscribe to our channel right now and hit that notification bell so you won't miss what happens next, as we uncover more inspiring tales of perseverance against all odds. Ilara's life in New York City had become a relentless cycle of hope and crushing disappointment, each audition a fleeting breath of possibility extinguished by polite rejections, or worse, deafening silence. She'd stand in line for hours, clutching her sheet music, listening to the polished trills of other hopefuls, her own extraordinary voice feeling increasingly unheard in the cacophony of the city's artistic ambition. The rejections chipped away at her, not at her talent, she told herself, but at her resilience. Each "thank you, we'll be in touch" felt like a direct assault on her dream, pushing her closer to an abyss of surrender. The financial strain was a constant, gnawing anxiety. Her eviction notice, now a crinkled memory tucked away in a drawer, served as a daily reminder of her precarious existence. To survive, Ilara had taken on a bewildering array of odd jobs, each more soul-crushing than the last. She'd poured coffee in bustling cafes, the aroma a stark contrast to the fragrant luxury of opera houses. She'd walked dogs for affluent Upper East Siders, their pampered pets enjoying better living conditions than she could afford. She'd even spent a humiliating week distributing flyers in Times Square, her operatic voice reduced to a monotone drone about discounted Broadway tickets. The pay was meager, enough only to cover a fraction of her rent and groceries, leaving little for voice lessons or proper attire for auditions. Her hands, once accustomed to gracefully holding a score, now bore the calluses of menial labor. The vibrant energy that once fueled her performances flickered, dimmed by exhaustion and the relentless grind. It was during one of her dog-walking gigs that she first truly encountered Julian Vance, notorious heir to the Vance Industries fortune. He wasn't a client, but a figure of almost mythical status within the city's elite circles. Ilara typically only saw him through the fleeting glimpses reported in gossip magazines or on society pages, always impeccably dressed, always surrounded by an aura of aloof privilege. He was the quintessential antagonist to her struggling artist narrative, a stark embodiment of the financial disparity that made her path so arduous. Julian, she knew, was famous not just for his inherited wealth but for his disdainful wit, his cynical view of those who aspired to anything beyond material acquisition, especially starving artists. He moved through the city's gilded cages with an air of inherited boredom, occasionally gracing charity galas with his presence. Not, it was rumored, out of altruism, but because they offered a fresh venue for his jaded observations and a prime opportunity for networking among his peers. Ilara's connection to such circles was tenuous at best, a thread woven through a series of chance encounters and desperate networking attempts. She heard whispers of an exclusive charity gala, an annual event hosted by a major arts patron, a woman known for her philanthropic endeavors. It was a long shot, almost an impossible dream to even get a foot in the door. Yet, a desperate spark ignited within her. This wasn't just another audition. This was an opportunity to bypass the usual gatekeepers, to sing for an audience that might actually possess the influence and resources to make a difference. Through a fortunate twist of fate and the unexpected kindness of an old vocal coach who had connections, Ilara secured a last-minute slot to perform a short piece at the gala. It wasn't prime time, probably just 5 minutes during a cocktail reception, but it was a chance, a glimmer of hope in the suffocating darkness of her current reality. The invitation, embossed with gold lettering, felt impossibly heavy in her hand, a tangible symbol of the chasm between her life and the lives of those who would attend. The night of the gala arrived with a nervous flutter in her stomach. Ilara had painstakingly chosen her best, albeit worn, evening dress, and spent hours trying to make her tired reflection look presentable. The venue was breathtaking, a grand ballroom shimmering with crystal chandeliers, filled with the murmur of polite conversation and the clinking of champagne flutes. Julian Vance was there, of course, a magnet for attention, lounging by a towering ice sculpture, a wry smile playing on his lips as he surveyed the room. Ilara tried to ignore him, to focus on the brief moment she would have on stage. She envisioned her voice cutting through the sophisticated din, captivating minds, touching souls. This was her chance, her single, fragile opportunity to rise above the noise of rejection and finally be truly heard. The stage awaited, a small platform in a vast, opulent room, and with it, the terrifying possibility of either soaring success or devastating public failure. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat for the performance that was about to unfold. The delicate strains of the string quartet died away, leaving a suspended silence in the opulent ballroom. Ilara, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, took a deep breath, preparing for the challenging area that was her only chance. Her voice, usually a beacon of control and power, trembled slightly as she began the opening notes of a lesser-known but intensely beautiful piece by Bellini. She poured every ounce of her soul into the music, envisioning the character's heartbreak, her longing, her desperate hope. The notes soared, pure and resonant, filling the vast space, momentarily silencing the polite murmurs and clinking of glasses. For a few glorious seconds, she felt it, the connection, the magic that opera could weave, drawing an audience into its emotional embrace. She saw a few heads turn, eyes widening, a flicker of genuine appreciation in their gazes. Then, a harsh, dismissive laugh cut through the exquisite melody like a rusty knife. It wasn't a social chuckle. It was loud, derisive, aimed squarely at her. Julian Vance, slumped carelessly in a velvet armchair near the back, a half-empty champagne flute dangling from his hand, shook his head slowly. His expression was a caricature of boredom, edged with a smirking contempt that made Ilara's stomach churn. He hadn't bothered to lower his voice, clearly enjoying the disruption. "Oh, for heaven's sake," he slurred, loud enough for a significant portion of the room to hear. "Another one? The struggling artist routine is getting so tired, don't you think? Such drama." He waved his hand dismissively, his gaze sweeping over the audience as if seeking validation for his boorish commentary. A few nervous titters rippled through the onlookers, some discreetly averting their gazes, others openly curious about the spectacle unfolding. Ilara's voice faltered, the high note she was reaching for cracking under the sudden onslaught of his cynicism. The carefully constructed emotional world she had built with her voice shattered around her. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, a hot flush spreading from her neck to her hairline. Every single eye in that room, it felt, was now fixed on her, not for her talent, but for the public shaming she was enduring. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole, to disappear into the ornate Persian rug beneath her feet. Her hands, clasped tightly in front of her, started to tremble uncontrollably. The music died on her lips, leaving an awkward, painful silence. Julian, sensing he had her cornered, pushed himself up from the chair, swaying slightly. He took a few unsteady steps forward, a predatory glint in his eyes, enjoying the discomfort he had created. "Look, I get it," he continued, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You've got a voice, passion, all that jazz. But really, an opera? Who even cares about opera anymore? It's a dying art, darling, a very, very expensive dying art." He flashed a condescending smile, his gaze raking over her simple but elegant, borrowed gown. He paused, taking another sip of champagne, clearly savoring the moment. "Tell you what," he said, suddenly brighter, a mischievous, alcohol-fueled idea sparking in his eyes. He spread his arms wide in a grand, theatrical gesture that was entirely out of place in the sophisticated setting. "You want to sing opera? Sing this opera, the entire role, and I'll write you a check for $1 million. He punctuated his statement with a flourish, as if he were bestowing a great gift. A collective gasp went through the room. $1 million was a staggering amount, even for these wealthy patrons. But the subtext was crystal clear. Julian was challenging her to an impossible feat, knowing full well the monumental effort, resources, and sheer vocal endurance required to perform an entire operatic role, especially for an unknown artist without a professional company backing her. He intended it as a humiliating joke, a public declaration of her inevitable failure, a way to underscore the absurdity of her artistic aspirations in his jaded view. He watched her, a smirk playing on his lips, expecting tears, a defeated retreat, anything but what came next. Ilara's vision blurred with unshed tears of rage and wounded pride. Her body was rigid with tension, humiliation washing over her in suffocating waves. For a moment, she was utterly paralyzed, struck dumb by the sheer audacity of his taunt. But then, a flicker ignited deep within her, a spark kindled by years of relentless struggle, countless rejections, and the quiet, unwavering belief in her own talent. This wasn't just about Julian Vance anymore. It was about every door slammed in her face, every patronizing smile, every whisper of doubt. It was about proving to herself, and to everyone who had ever dismissed her, that her dreams were not a joke. The anger, cold and sharp, began to push aside the mortification. She straightened her shoulders, her chin lifting defiantly, her gaze locked onto Julian Vance's smug, slightly hazy eyes. The room seemed to hold its breath, sensing a turning point. "Which opera?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady, though it was barely above a whisper. Julian stumbled backward slightly, genuinely surprised. His smirk wavered. He hadn't expected her to engage, let alone accept. He had anticipated her breaking down, fleeing in shame. This was not the reaction he had scripted. His eyes narrowed, trying to gauge her sincerity. "Which opera?" he repeated slowly, tasting the words. He then threw back his head and laughed, a loud, booming sound that echoed through the ballroom. "Oh, this is rich. You're serious? You actually think you could do it?" He pointed a finger at her, his amusement returning in full force. "Let's make it a proper challenge then, shall we? Something grand. Puccini. Turandot. The Princess Turandot herself. Can't get much more demanding than that, can it? An opera that has crushed even seasoned professionals. The Ice Princess, the Riddle, the High Seas. You sing the entire role of Turandot, from beginning to end, with a full orchestra, a chorus, the whole shebang, and I'll hand you a check for $1 million on the final bow." He finished with a flourish, clearly believing he had called her bluff in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The crowd murmured, some shocked, some titillated by the absurdity of the proposition. Ilara met his gaze, her eyes now burning with a fierce, unwavering determination. The humiliation was still there, a bitter aftertaste, but it was now overshadowed by a powerful surge of defiance. She could feel the stares, the whispers, the unspoken judgments, but she also felt a strange kind of liberation. She had nothing left to lose. This was her chance, however insane it seemed, to reclaim her dignity, to prove her worth, not to Julian Vance, but to herself. "Accepted," she stated, her voice clear and resonant this time, echoing with an unexpected conviction. The single word hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown. Julian Vance's jaw dropped. His eyes, momentarily, lost their mocking gleam, replaced by a flicker of genuine shock, quickly followed by a renewed, almost giddy amusement. He threw his head back and roared with laughter, convinced she was either delusional or incredibly naive. "Accepted," he chortled, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "Oh, this is going to be delicious." He clapped his hands together, entirely oblivious to the steely resolve now hardening in Ilara's gaze. He saw only a desperate girl making a fool of herself, providing him with endless entertainment. But Ilara saw something else entirely. A challenge, yes, but also a door that had, against all odds, just swung wide open. The gauntlet had been thrown, and Ilara, against all logic and expectation, had picked it up. The immediate aftermath of her defiant "accepted" was a blur of hushed conversations and astonished glances, but in her mind, a sharp clarity began to form. Turandot. Puccini's monumental opera, an Everest for sopranos, a role that demanded not just vocal prowess, but immense stamina and dramatic force. It was a role she had studied in conservatories, a dream role tucked away for a distant, perhaps impossible, future. Now, that future had arrived, albeit under the most bizarre and humiliating circumstances. The first step, she knew, was to embrace the impossible. She chose Turandot, not just because Julian had named it, but because it represented the pinnacle of what she aspired to achieve. Performing it would not just win $1 million, it would solidify her identity as an artist. Days blurred into a single-minded obsession. Ilara transformed her tiny apartment into a war room. Scores of Turandot were spread across every surface, marked with her meticulous notes, vocal exercises taped to the bathroom mirror. She devoured recordings, analyzing every nuance of Callas, Nielsen, and Sutherland, internalizing the icy cruelty and ultimate vulnerability of Princess Turandot. Her voice, already powerful, needed to become an instrument of unparalleled precision and emotional depth for this role. Every morning, she would rise before dawn, her vocal warm-ups echoing through the thinly walled building, much to the chagrin of her neighbors, who nonetheless offered sympathetic glances, having heard the whispers of the billionaire's dare. She knew she couldn't do this alone. Her first call was to Elena, her former vocal coach and a surrogate mother figure. Elena, a woman whose stern exterior hid a heart of gold, initially reacted with a mixture of disbelief and outrage. That arrogant boy, making a mockery of art, she fumed over the phone, but as Ilara calmly explained her resolve, her unwavering decision to turn this insult into an opportunity, Elena's skepticism melted into a fierce, protective determination. Turandot, you say? A beast of a role. But if anyone can tame it, it's you, child. Elena finally conceded, her voice softening. Come to my studio. We'll start tomorrow. No charge, of course. That simple offer was a lifeline, an anchor in the swirling chaos. Next, Ilara reached out to Marco, a brilliant but perpetually struggling conductor she had befriended years ago. Marco, famously cynical about the opera world's elitism, found the entire premise absurdly hilarious. A billionaire's son, $1 million dare, and Turandot? This is either a Shakespearean comedy or a modern tragedy waiting to happen, he quipped. Yet beneath his jaded exterior, he recognized Ilara's extraordinary talent and the sheer audacity of her undertaking. He agreed to lend his expertise, knowing full well the monumental task of assembling even a small ensemble, let alone a full orchestra, for such a venture. I'll help you find musicians, Ilara, but don't expect miracles. Orchestras don't grow on trees, especially not for free. His agreement, though cautious, felt like another small victory. As news of the billionaire's dare began to spread through the tight-knit, often gossipy New York opera community, a surprising groundswell of support began to emerge. Struggling costume designers offered their services for free, eager for a chance to showcase their craft. Lighting technicians, stage managers, even a retired set designer, all began to volunteer their time and skills, drawn by the David and Goliath narrative and Ilara's palpable sincerity. They saw in her an embodiment of their own dreams, their own struggles against an industry often dominated by money and connections. They knew the immense difficulty of her task, and while many privately doubted her ability to pull it off, they admired her courage. They were a motley crew, united by a shared love for opera and a collective disdain for the kind of casual arrogance Julian Vance represented. They were her unlikely army, ready to help her wage war against the impossible. They understood that this wasn't just about Ilara anymore. It was about all of them. Julian Vance, meanwhile, remained supremely amused by the unfolding spectacle. He occasionally sent his assistant to observe Ilara's progress, receiving reports back about her frantic preparations. He found it endlessly entertaining, a high-stakes reality show he had personally funded. "Still at it, is she?" he'd ask, a smirk playing on his lips as he reviewed the latest update. "Good. Let her waste her breath. It'll make her eventual spectacular failure all the more satisfying." He envisioned a half-empty hall, a few pathetic friends in attendance, and Ilara cracking under the pressure, her voice faltering, her dreams shattering on stage. He pictured himself, magnanimous in victory, perhaps offering her a consolation prize, a patronizing pat on the head. He was confident of her defeat, convinced that the sheer logistical and financial hurdles would prove insurmountable. He watched her early struggles with a detached, almost scientific interest, like a cat toying with a mouse, certain that the chase would end exactly as he predicted. He underestimated her raw talent, her incredible work ethic, and most critically, the fierce fire of determination that burned within her, stoked by his very own condescension. He saw only a naive girl. He failed to see the warrior she was becoming. The acceptance, audacious and resounding, hung in the gilded air of the ballroom long after Julian Vance had dismissed it as a fleeting moment of madness. For Ilara, however, it was the first concrete step on a path fraught with unimaginable challenges, a path she was now irrevocably committed to treading. Choosing Turandot had been a bold, almost reckless move, necessitated by Julian's specific dare, but it was also an opera she adored, its majestic score resonating deeply within her soul. The sheer scale of staging such a monumental work, however, began to unfold before her, like an insurmountable mountain range. The first hurdle, predictably, was financial. Julian's challenge had come with no advance, no provision for the astronomical costs involved. She had her meager savings, a sum that barely covered a month's rent in her cramped apartment, let alone the tens of thousands required for a full operatic production. Securing a venue alone was a nightmare. Every theater manager she contacted either laughed outright, assuming it was a prank, or quoted figures that made her head spin. The idea of renting a space large enough for an orchestra, a chorus, and an audience, complete with proper acoustics and technical capabilities, felt like a cruel joke. She pounded pavements, made endless phone calls, and sent countless emails, only to be met with polite rejections or outright bewilderment. Landlords of smaller halls, though more affordable, lacked the technical infrastructure needed for Turandot's elaborate demands. Finding musicians was another Herculean task. A full symphony orchestra was an expensive luxury, and while many talented musicians existed, they expected to be paid. She tried appealing to friends and contacts, explaining the bizarre circumstances, but even with their goodwill, they had bills to pay and couldn't commit to weeks of unpaid rehearsals and performances. The concept of a full chorus, essential for the opera's dramatic impact, also presented a logistical and financial quagmire. Each no she received, each slammed door, chipped away at her resolve, threatening to confirm Julian's cynical prophecy. Doubt, a creeping, insidious vine, began to coil around her heart. Was this truly impossible? Was she truly just a fool dancing to a billionaire's whimsical tune? Yet, with every setback, a deeper well of determination seemed to spring forth. She remembered her father's unwavering belief in her, her mother's quiet sacrifices. She thought of every struggle she had faced to get to New York, every rejection she had endured. This challenge, absurd as it was, felt like one last, desperate chance to prove her worth, not to Julian, but to herself and to the memory of her dreams. She started working multiple jobs, exhausting herself between waitressing shifts, tutoring gigs, and late-night vocal practice. Her apartment became her sanctuary and her prison, filled with scores and notes, her voice echoing off the thin walls as she meticulously studied the role of Turandot. She slept fewer hours, ate simpler meals, and pushed her body and voice to their absolute limits, driven by an inner fire that refused to be extinguished. Her friends, initially skeptical, saw the raw intensity of her commitment and became more actively involved. Sarah, her roommate, a graphic designer, started sketching out rudimentary set designs and costume concepts, offering her skills pro bono. David, a struggling conductor Ilara knew from her conservatory days, agreed to lead a makeshift orchestra if she could somehow find the musicians, though his own financial precarity constantly loomed. Even her old vocal coach, Professor Elena Petrova, who had initially dismissed the whole affair as a ridiculous stunt, was moved by Ilara's unwavering dedication. Professor Petrova offered free coaching sessions, meticulously dissecting every aria, every recitative, every nuance of Turandot's complex character. Ilara poured her remaining savings into renting rehearsal spaces by the hour, buying sheet music, and even offering small stipends to a few committed musicians, hoping to build momentum. Meanwhile, a peculiar shift began to occur in Julian Vance. Initially, he viewed Ilara's struggles as part of the ongoing amusement, a predictable unraveling that validated his contemptuous worldview. He'd occasionally send an assistant to check in on her, expecting reports of abject failure and despair. But the reports that trickled back were different. They spoke of a relentless, almost maniacal dedication. Of Ilara, alone in a cold rehearsal room, singing for hours until her voice gave out. Of her somehow recruiting a handful of volunteer musicians driven by her sheer force of will. His cynical amusement slowly began to morph into something else, a grudging curiosity. He started paying closer attention, not just to the reports, but to the whispers spreading through their shared social circles. People were talking about the opera challenge, some in mockery, others with a growing sense of wonder regarding this unknown singer's tenacity. Julian, accustomed to a world where money smoothed every path, found Ilara's ability to conjure something out of nothing through sheer grit alone utterly baffling. He wasn't impressed, not yet, but he was certainly intrigued. He saw glimpses of something in her unwavering spirit that he rarely encountered in his own privileged, effortless existence. He began to observe her more closely, a small, almost imperceptible crack forming in his carefully constructed edifice of indifference. The joke, he realized with a slight tremor of unease, was getting more complicated. The days leading up to the performance became a blur of frantic activity, a relentless gauntlet of near disasters that tested Ilara's resolve at every turn. Securing the venue had been one battle, but transforming the slightly dilapidated community theater into something capable of hosting. Turandot was an entirely different beast. The stage lighting, initially deemed adequate by a well-meaning but inexperienced volunteer, flickered erratically, threatening to plunge crucial scenes into darkness. A vital piece of the orchestra's percussion, a gong meant to announce the arrival of the formidable princess, was mistakenly delivered to a high school play rehearsal across town, only to be recovered hours before a full orchestra run-through, its absence causing a ripple of panic through the already stressed musicians. The costume department, a small team of dedicated if somewhat overwhelmed volunteers, grappled with fabric shortages and an ambitious design scheme. One moment, they were celebrating the successful completion of Calaf's elaborate tunic. The next, they were frantically searching for a lost box of embellishments crucial for Turandot's iconic gown. Each hiccup, each minor catastrophe, felt like a personal attack, a test designed to break her spirit. There were moments, late at night, when the exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, stealing her breath. She would stand alone on the darkened stage, the echoing silence amplifying her doubts, the sheer impossibility of it all threatening to overwhelm her. The memory of Julian Vance's mocking laughter, however, would always pierce through the fatigue, a sharp, invigorating jab that reminded her why she was doing this. She wasn't just performing an opera, she was fulfilling a promise she had made to herself, a promise to defy every expectation of failure. Yet, despite the endless challenges, a strange, unexpected buzz began to build around Ilara's unconventional performance. Word of the Billionaire's dare had spread like wildfire through the city's social circles and beyond, captivating an audience far wider than the usual opera-going crowd. It was a story tailor-made for headlines. The unknown singer, the arrogant air, the impossible challenge. Local news outlets, initially skeptical, started sending reporters to cover the frantic preparations. Podcasts and online forums debated her chances, some predicting glorious triumph, others assured humiliating failure. People were fascinated by the sheer audacity of it, drawn to the underdog narrative with a compelling human interest twist. Tickets, initially thought to be a struggle to sell, were suddenly in high demand, snatched up not just by opera aficionados but by those simply curious to witness the outcome of such an improbable wager. The humble community theater, usually home to amateur productions, was suddenly at the center of an unprecedented cultural phenomenon. This unexpected surge of public interest, however, brought its own pressures. Every delayed prop, every missed cue in rehearsal felt magnified, now under the invisible scrutiny of countless spectators. Ilara felt the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders, not just from her supportive friends and family, but from an entire city that had decided to invest its collective hope in her journey. She found herself giving impromptu interviews to local reporters, her voice hoarse from rehearsals, trying to articulate the passion behind her seemingly quixotic quest. Meanwhile, Julian Vance found himself in an unfamiliar and increasingly uncomfortable position. His initial amusement had long since dissipated, replaced by a complex stew of emotions he couldn't quite decipher. He had envisioned a quick, entertaining spectacle of failure, a punchline delivered at a pauper's expense. Instead, he was witnessing something else entirely. Reports of her tireless efforts, the dedication of her makeshift team, the growing public fascination. It all chipped away at his carefully constructed cynicism. He found himself reading articles about her, watching snippets of rehearsal footage online, a grudging admiration beginning to bloom within him. He saw the fire in her eyes, the sheer stubborn refusal to yield, and it resonated with something dormant deep inside him, a ghost of his own unrealized ambition. His friends, who had initially egged him on, now spoke of Ilara with a certain reverence, marveling at her resilience. Conversations at his usual haunts were no longer about his lavish parties but about that opera singer and Julian's challenge. He watched as Ilara, the woman he had intended to humiliate, inadvertently gained a public profile that dwarfed his own superficial notoriety. A flicker of respect, perhaps even a nascent sense of responsibility, began to take root in his chest. He had set this impossible task, and now he watched, somewhat bewildered, as she systematically dismantled every obstacle he had unknowingly placed in her path. The entertainment he had sought was still there, but it was no longer the cheap laugh he had anticipated. It was something deeper, more profound, and unsettlingly introspective. He struggled with his ingrained cynicism, the very foundation of his worldview beginning to crack under the weight of her undeniable spirit. The joke, he realized with a jolt, was slowly but surely turning on him. He was no longer the instigator of a cruel prank, but an unwitting participant in a story far grander than his initial shallow intentions. He found himself almost hoping she would succeed, a notion that would have appalled his former self. The performance was drawing near, and Julian, much to his own surprise, felt a genuine anticipation stirring within him, an eagerness to see how this extraordinary drama would finally unfold. The air in the modest theater crackled with an almost tactile energy as the night of the opera finally arrived. Every seat was filled, not just by friends and family of Ilara and her small, devoted team, but by an eclectic mix of opera aficionados, curious onlookers drawn by the viral story, and even a smattering of local celebrities hoping to witness history, or perhaps a glorious failure. The buzz was palpable, a low hum of hushed anticipation that vibrated through the old wooden seats and up to the velvet curtains. Julian Vance, true to his word, sat conspicuously in a front-row seat, an almost regal stillness about him that belied the internal storm raging within. He was impeccably dressed, a silent sentinel amidst the murmuring crowd, his face a mask of carefully constructed neutrality, though his eyes, darting occasionally to the stage, betrayed a nascent flicker of anxiety. He wasn't just here to watch. He was here to bear witness to the consequences of his own impulsive challenge, a challenge that had unexpectedly grown into something far larger than he could have ever imagined. Backstage, the atmosphere was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Wardrobe adjustments, last-minute vocal warm-ups, and whispered words of encouragement filled the small dressing rooms. Ilara, however, felt a strange, detached calm wash over her, punctuated by sudden, violent tremors of nerves. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, each beat a frantic reminder of the immense pressure resting squarely on her shoulders. She looked at her reflection in the dusty mirror, a warrior preparing for battle. Her costume, a simple yet elegant gown, felt heavy, not just with fabric, but with the weight of every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every doubt she had fought to overcome. The knowledge of the stakes involved was a crushing burden. Her future, her reputation, the hopes of everyone who had believed in her, and, yes, $1 million that represented not just wealth, but validation. What if her voice cracked? What if she forgot a line? What if, despite everything, she simply wasn't enough? The sheer magnitude of the performance, the demanding role, the relentless media attention, all coalesced into a suffocating blanket of apprehension. Her mentor, an elderly, stoic mezzo-soprano named Clara, who had tirelessly coached Ilara, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Remember, it's just you and the music, child," Clara whispered, her voice raspy with age but firm with conviction. "Let your soul sing." Ilara took a deep, shaky breath, trying to channel Clara's unwavering belief. She closed her eyes, picturing the notes, feeling the melodies resonate within her very being. This wasn't just about Julian Vance's challenge anymore. It was about honoring her own indomitable spirit, the unyielding passion that had driven her through countless adversities. This was for every struggling artist, every silenced voice, every dream deferred. Then, a hush fell over the theater. The house lights dimmed, plunging the audience into a respectful darkness. The orchestra, a patchwork of volunteers and seasoned professionals, played the overture, its mournful yet powerful notes filling the space, building an almost unbearable tension. Ilara stood in the wings, her palms sweating, her throat suddenly dry. This was it, the culmination of weeks, months, years of dedication. Pacing just outside the proscenium arch, she could hear the gentle rustle of programs, the faint cough scattered among the eager faces. She could feel Julian Vance's eyes, a singular point of focus in the sea of darkness. Even before she stepped into the spotlight, the moment arrived. With a final fortifying breath, Ilara walked onto the stage, bathed in the soft glow of the stage lights. For a split second, she felt completely exposed, utterly vulnerable, a lone figure standing against the enormity of the challenge. Her heart lurched, a terrifying beat that seemed to echo in the sudden, profound silence of the theater. She saw the expectant faces, a blur of shapes in the darkness. And then, her gaze locked onto Julian Vance, whose expression remained inscrutable. Her first notes were hesitant, a fragile whisper that seemed to tentatively emerge from her very soul. A subtle tremor ran through her voice, a testament to the raw fear and exhilaration coursing through her veins. But as the music enveloped her, as she immersed herself in the character and the story, something shifted. The fear began to recede, replaced by an unstoppable surge of emotion and an unwavering connection to the music. She closed her eyes for a fleeting second, letting the notes guide her, allowing the melody to become an extension of her deepest feelings. Then, Ilara opened her eyes, and her voice began to soar. It was no longer a hesitant whisper, but a powerful, resonant wave that washed over the audience, filling every corner of the theater. The raw emotion, the breathtaking talent, the sheer, undeniable beauty of her instrument transcended the technicalities of opera. It was a voice that spoke directly to the soul, rich with experience, imbued with a captivating vulnerability and an astonishing strength. Each note was perfectly placed, each phrase imbued with profound meaning, her dramatic interpretation flawless. The audience was mesmerized, held captive by the sheer force of her artistry. They leaned forward collectively, caught in the grip of her unparalleled performance. Julian Vance, in his front row seat, was visibly stunned. His carefully constructed mask crumbled, his jaw slacked almost imperceptibly, his eyes widening with a mixture of disbelief and awe. The collective inhale of the audience, almost imperceptible, was the sound of a theater frozen in time, utterly captivated by the extraordinary voice that poured from the stage, weaving a spell that no one present would ever forget. The joke was no longer on her, nor was it on him. It was simply gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated art. The final soaring note hung in the air, a shimmering tapestry of sound that seemed to defy gravity, then slowly, gracefully, dissolved into the hushed reverence of the theater. For a long moment, an eternity seemed to pass, and only the collective, held breath of the audience permeated the space. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the silence erupted. A single tentative clap blossomed into a torrent of applause, a wave of sound that crashed over the stage, carrying with it shouts of "Brava!" and "Encore!" Ilara stood there, bathed in the blinding stage lights, her chest heaving, the remnants of the opera's emotional journey still coursing through her veins. Tears, hot and uncontrollable, streamed down her face, not of sorrow, but of an overwhelming, cathartic release. She had done it. Against every impossible odd, every cynical expectation, every moment of self-doubt that had gnawed at her, she had sung the entire opera. The thunderous, standing ovation was deafening, a physical force that vibrated through her very bones, a validation of every sacrifice, every late night, every strained vocal cord. From his front row seat, Julian Vance rose slowly, his usually composed demeanor shattered. His face, typically a mask of detached amusement, was now etched with a profound awe, his eyes glistening with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't merely applauding. He was roaring, his voice raw and uncharacteristic, swept up in the collective euphoria. He pushed through the throng of ecstatic patrons, making his way backstage, a sense of urgency propelling him forward. When he finally reached Ilara, surrounded by her tearful, overjoyed friends and mentors, he simply stood there for a moment, unable to speak, the magnitude of her achievement washing over him. The woman before him, sweat-streaked and emotionally drained, was not just a singer. She was a force of nature, a testament to the indomitable human spirit. He extended his hand, not with the condescending air of a benefactor, but with the genuine respect of an equal. "Ilara," he began, his voice surprisingly soft, utterly devoid of its usual arrogance. That was extraordinary, beyond anything I could have imagined. He reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulling out his checkbook. This gesture, so anticipated by many, carried none of the original mocking intent. He wrote out the amount, his hand steady, the figure appearing on the check like a beacon of new possibility. $1 million. He handed it to her, his gaze unwavering. This isn't a joke, Ilara. This is an acknowledgement of pure, unadulterated talent, of relentless dedication, and of a spirit that simply refused to be broken. You didn't just sing an opera, you taught me a lesson I desperately needed to learn. Ilara clutched the check, the ink still fresh, her fingers trembling. It wasn't just money. It was the culmination of a lifelong dream, the key to unlocking a future she had almost given up on. With the $1 million, Ilara didn't hesitate. She paid off her debts, secured a comfortable apartment, and most importantly, invested in her career. She used a significant portion to fund further vocal training with the most renowned coaches, expanding her repertoire and refining her craft. The performance, dubbed the Billionaire's Dare, quickly became a legend in the opera world, opening doors that had once been firmly shut. Offers poured in from prestigious opera houses across the globe. She debuted in major roles, her voice captivating audiences from Milan to Sydney, her name synonymous with passion and perseverance. Ilara, the struggling artist from a small town, had become a global sensation, her voice celebrated and adored. But Ilara hadn't forgotten the arduous journey. She established the Starlight Foundation for Aspiring Artists, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing financial grants, mentorship, and performance opportunities for talented young artists facing similar struggles. She became a patron of the arts, using her platform to champion those who, like her, possessed immense talent but lacked the resources to cultivate it. Julian Vance, profoundly changed by the experience, became one of Ilara's most generous and steadfast supporters. His transformation was remarkable. The cynical, entitled billionaire's son began to shed his previous persona, embracing philanthropy with the same intensity he once applied to frivolous pursuits. He joined the board of the Starlight Foundation, dedicating his vast network and resources to its mission. He found a new purpose, a genuine satisfaction in using his privilege to uplift others, a stark contrast to the emptiness of his former life. He saw Ilara not just as a singer, but as the catalyst for his own spiritual awakening, the person who had shown him the true value of grit, determination, and the profound beauty of art. The story of Ilara, the singer who stared down an impossible challenge and conquered it with the sheer power of her voice and spirit, became an enduring legend. Her journey, from the brink of eviction to international acclaim, served as a beacon of hope and inspiration, a reminder that true talent, coupled with unwavering resolve, can transcend any obstacle, even the most cynical of dares. Her voice, which had once frozen a theater in awe, now echoed across the world, a testament to the power of dreams realized and lives profoundly transformed. If Ilara's incredible journey has moved you, if it's ignited a spark of hope or inspired you to chase your own impossible dreams, then please give this video a like. Share it with anyone who needs to hear a story of triumph against the odds. And don't forget to leave a comment below telling us what your favorite part of Ilara's inspiring path was. Your engagement helps us bring more stories of perseverance, passion, and extraordinary human spirit to light. Subscribe to our channel for more tales that will leave you spellbound and encourage you to believe in the magic of possibility.